right. Good morning, Gary, or good afternoon. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Like we were talking about, just a little Peruvian hiccups this morning with water faucets and construction, but we're doing well.
Are
So,
you in Peru now?
yep, I'm in the Sacred Valley, so I'm in Huicho,
Uh-huh.
and I think this is probably I'm not too far from where you were around here in the '70s. I was just in I was in Lamai on Sunday for a wedding.
Uh-huh.
And so,
Yes.
you reference Lamai quite a bit in your book. Um,
Right. I
but
was mostly on the hill up above the valley, so near Maras
Near Maras.
and the village where I lived was Mishmanai, which is near the great sinkholes of Morai.
Okay, right. And is that near Chinchero?
It's across the plain from Chinchero.
Okay.
So when you look out from the village where I was, Mishmanai, Chinchero is in the distance, and then beyond that, you see the hills above Cusco, right? So it's
Okay.
all yeah, it's within line of sight of Chinchero, and then in the other direction is the great Salinas that overlook the Sacred Valley near Ollantaytambo.
Uh-huh. Okay. I still haven't made it up to Ollantaytambo yet, but that's on my list in the next month or so. There's a very interesting family. I wonder if they would have been here. Oh, it's a shame. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was kind of an explorer. Wrote a couple of books on Andean mythology.
Randall.
Randall, yes. So I know his son here.
Oh, do you really?
Yeah, his
Oh,
son. His son is here. The family has the. They still have the hotel and the distillery. The distillery is quite famous now. They've won
oh,
quite a few awards for different medicinal plant kind of alcohols that they distill up there. But
oh, is
yeah,
that
I was
right?
it just unreal. I was just digging through Andean mythology, and I come across this guy Randall. I'm like, wow, this guy's pretty rad, and I'm starting to
Oh,
do
yeah.
some research, and then I find his wife, and then they're talking about how this family started this hotel, and I'm like, oh, that sounds kind of familiar. Oh, they have a distillery. Oh, wait a second, I know that guy, and so I know one of the sons, who's actually a quite renowned artist in Lima
Yes, I know
nowadays.
his. Yes, I know his work, and I've corresponded with him. And
Okay.
I mean, I don't think I've ever actually met him. The two boys were born like they were just babies when I was there. But Randall, that's an interesting story. He was an adventurer and an explorer, and he was quite knowledgeable about Andean matters. And I don't know if you're aware, but he actually died. He was bitten by his dog, a rabbit, who was rabid. He was his own dog, right?
Really?
Yeah, and so that was in the probably the end of the 70s, early 80s, something like that. And then his wife stayed on there with the boys and continued to run the hotel. So, but they were quite notable people around there in those years, and were quite famous. They would come to Cusco all as a clan, and were
Oh,
really
really?
interesting people, right?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, as soon as I found out about them, I was like, because I met the son at a separate kind of like barbecue, 4 or 5 months ago, and it was just clear, like, man, this guy's got some juice. You know what I mean? Like that family's holding something quite interesting.
yeah, yeah. Is the mother still there?
I believe she's in Lima. I haven't met her before. I
Yeah.
believe she's in Lima for the most part, and then the one son stays up there full time. They have the hotel, like a full organic restaurant. They have their own little organic farm that supplies the restaurant and the distillery going on up there. I mean, I came to your work through all this study that I'm doing on particularly weather forecasting, astronomy, animals, plants, things like that. And so you were here starting in what year did you come to Peru to do field work?
Well, I came first in 1973. I came with Tom Zuidema, who was a Dutch ethnohistorian who studied the Inca, who was very interested in um, Inca history, Inca calendars, Inca ritualism. You'll have to excuse
Yeah, no worries.
the siren outside. I'm in downtown Warsaw, and
Okay,
there are continual sirens going by
sure.
outside. But so I went though first in 1971, and then I went again. That was just for some summer research. Then I went again in 1973. Stayed mostly in Cusco, and then it was not until 1975 that I actually went to the small community of Mishmanai above the archaeological site of Morai. And I had done some research in Morai. I was working there with an anthropologist named John Earls, a very famous fellow who did work in um, uh, uh, looking at sort of Inca environmental knowledge and how they constructed archaeological sites for agricultural purposes. And he was interested in Marai, thinking it was an agricultural experimental station. So we camped out there several months, and the village of Mishmanai was just above, and the women and children would come down and pasturing their cattle down into the side of Morai, and we got to know them. So I got a grant from the Organization of American States in 1975 to do my field work. And so the only village that I really knew was the village of Morai. So I just went straight there and um, asked if I could have a room, if I could rent a room. And so the rest is, yeah, the long story of then staying in the village, living there, and working with the men in the village, and as often as I could, urging and encouraging people to talk to me about the stars. I was interested in astronomy and the calendar, and just to back up a little bit, I mentioned that I worked with Tom Zuidema and that he was interested in the Incas, but he especially was in those years in the mid 1970s interested in reconstructing the Inca calendar system to see if, on the basis of the information recorded in the Spanish chronicles, if we could reconstruct what must have been a very complex calendar system of the Incas. And so I worked with him and then determined when I started doing my field work that, well, we didn't really know much at all about what people in the countryside, the Quechua speaking people in villages around Cusco, what they said about the stars and the sun and the moon and the planets. And so when I got my grant to do field work, I decided that I would carry out a study in a village and learn as much as I could about their astronomy, their cosmology, etc.
Okay, fascinating. And so, with the calendar work, the astronomy being a large missing piece, were there other pieces that were more intact of the calendar that you guys came to? And then, really quickly, just to clarify, I mean, would this be kind of a mishmash of really it's we would call it an Incan calendar for the sake of easy a reference point, but is it also likely that a lot of the calendar is pre-Incan and like a deep Quechua pre-Incan calendar that would be really what you would find?
That's an excellent question. I mean, and it's a question that we don't really know the answer to, but we presume that the Incas didn't invent their calendar whole cloth from nothing. I mean, they were living in a place where people had been living for literally a few thousand years, and agriculture was practiced in that region. from very early times. Camelid herding, herding llamas and alpacas was also a part of the economy. And so going back to much earlier times, Wari times, for instance, the Wari, a very famous pre-Inca empire from about 600 AD to 1000 AD. They had settlements, sites in what would become the, uh, the region of the capital city of Cusco, the capital of the Inca Empire. The Wari had occupied that area, and then even people before the Wari. So clearly, people were living there. People were exposed to the same ecological and environmental circumstances and to the same patterns of the rise and set of stars and the sun and the moon and the planets as seen from that particular um, geographical setting. So, yeah,
Mm.
we call it the Inca calendar, but it was no doubt a very long-standing calendar devised in that part of the Andes before the Incas.
Right. And so with the calendars, for those who don't know, too much about ancient calendars, but it's essentially it's stars, planets, winds, animals, plants, and they're oftentimes mythologized, and you see that in artistry or in pottery, as well as documents or stone left behind. But the big thing would be a lot of these archaeological sites that are around this area, and it seems to be that the the Incans were able to scale their society and culture because they were tracking so well of these things. And so in your field work, you talk a lot about the kind of, it's like the mapping of the stars to the landscape or finding a reference point. And tell us about that part of the work.
Well, that part of the work, seeing the relationship between the land and the sky, came through the field work that I was doing in Mishmanai. And so the way I actually did my field work was, as I mentioned, I often would work in the field with men during the day doing different agricultural tasks. I sort of decided from the beginning of being there that it was either sit in my hut and just wait for somebody to come talk to me or go out and work with them. So every day I would do agricultural work in the fields with the people and then, or with the men. And then I would get chit-chatting with people. And if I found someone who was very interesting and very talkative, and then I would ask them if if they were willing to come talk to me about astronomy, about the stars. And so they would come to my house, and then my house was in the middle of this very small village. Mishmanai just had probably about 40 or 50 houses at the time, probably 200 or 300 people, and but it was set in a valley surrounded by hills. And as soon as people started talking about the stars and the sun and moon, they always used the landscape, the mountains, as signposts for indicating where celestial phenomena, where they rose or where they set. And so it was a system of astronomy that integrated the features of the landscape with what they saw in the sky and what they chose to focus on in the sky. So, I mean, there are however many zillions of stars, and so any given society has to make its decision about what it will focus on. And usually, what you focus on is what's relevant to you in terms of the particular issues that you have of keeping track of time. So if you have a if you're in an environment where it's critical that you say plant or harvest at certain times, then you observe the world around you, and you observe birds, you observe plants, you observe whatever's there, but also you observe what stars are rising when it's time for you to plant or harvest, and what stars are setting, and then but not just but then those are rising and setting behind named mountains, named places, places that are part of the local uh, 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 um, lore of the landscape, and they have names, and often they're just to identify what they look like, but sometimes they're also linked to time periods. They may be linked to deities as well, and so yeah. I mean, it was always from the very beginning. There was always this sense that there was this intimate connection between the landscape, the land, and the sky. And this is why, I mean, in the end, the book that I wrote as my doctoral dissertation, I named "At the Crossroads of the Earth and the Sky."
Hmm.
People have often told me there are too many "these" in that title, but I wanted to indicate that one of the critical features of their cosmology was their organization of the space of the village, inside the village.
Hmm.
And it was organized on the sort of framework of two intersecting footpaths that made a cross in the middle of the village. So a great cross that crossed right where there was a small chapel in the middle of the village. And so that was one crossroads, and that was their earthly crossroads. But then, if you've read my book, you know that uh, one other uh, critical fundamental crossroads in their cosmology was the crossing of the Milky Way in the sky above them. So, uh, in the southern hemisphere, one has a remarkably clear view of the Milky Way, but seen from the southern hemisphere, the Milky Way is much brighter, much more apparent, much more dramatic than when seen from the northern hemisphere. And it has, over the course of time, over the days, the weeks, the months, the years, it has two major axes through the sky. So one goes from the northeast to the southwest, one goes from the northwest to the southeast, and those replace each other every 12 hours. You won't always see those crossing in the zenith, but when they do cross in the zenith, there's a great cross overhead. So in Mismanai, they talked about, they metaphorized, they made a connection, a link, an analogy between the cross in the sky and the Milky Way and the cross in the village. And so that was why in my book I called "At the Crossroads of the Earth and of the Sky," because there were two crossroads.
I
Right.
love it. Yeah, it's
Sorry for that long
no,
explanation of the title.
no, that's fantastic. I mean, it's kind of hard to do it justice. I mean, even it's such a shame that I'm so bad at geometry and just spatial things. But I have to hand. Did you hand draw all your own little Cosmo things that in the book and the Earth and the axes and the spheres and the all those types of things?
Several of those drawings were done by an artist who was a good friend of mine in Cusco at the time. His name was Don Wilson. He was just an artist who lived in Cusco and enjoyed the culture and the society of Cusco.
Hmm.
And but he was an obsessive fellow, and I made some sketches of what I understood of things about the cosmology, and took them to him, and he became just obsessed with drawing them, and he drew them in incredible, fabulous detail.
Very much
With
so.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm very much indebted to him, and so he actually created the some of the major drawings in that book about the cosmology, and then subsequently, uh, I had the good fortune of having a girlfriend who became my wife, who was an artist, and who drew a lot of the other drawings that were included in the book as well. So she was my wife then. She's still my wife now. So yeah.
Okay.
So she's illustrated a lot of my work, and much of or many of the illustrations in that book were her work. Her
Okay. Well,
name's Julia Meyerson. Yeah.
they're wonderful illustrations, and yeah, I still have to go back to wrap my head because every night I'm going out on the roof. I have a very 360 view where I am at, compared to some of the other spots where people live up against the mountain.
Right.
um, and just trying to, just playing with it of looking out every night, seeing which stars are rising first, who do I see first, and and just putting things together. But and then I read your book, and I'm like, oh man, I got a long ways to go. It just the
Uh,
sophistication is extraordinary.
well, I will also say that one thing that I did that really helped me see it in the sky was to in Cusco. I had the good fortune, as I was writing up my field notes, of finding a celestial globe in a store in Cusco. And if you have a chance to do that, I highly recommend it, because with a celestial globe, it's as though you're God looking down on the universe, and all of the stars and the constellations are there in the globe, and so you can and it's time coordinated, so to show where the sun is as it's moving through the stars at different times of the year. So if you get a celestial globe, it will. I think it will help you uh, identify and actually look for what you might need to look for in order to follow the description of the cosmology that I give in the book.
Right. Okay. Great idea. That's on my shopping list now for sure. Um, Speaking of Cusco and just this idea of mapping the stars to the physical geography of the Earth, I believe there's some people who've done quite a bit of work on that as well. Are you familiar with that? With like Cusco originally being pretty much a replication of constellations or stars or whatever they were working with, and that they brought it down to the Earth, kind of similar to what it seems other cultures have done in other places in the world.
I'm not actually familiar with that. I mean, there was not um, a sort of school of thought when I was in Cusco in the 70s and 80s that focused on that, uh, that argued that. Like there's a long-standing tradition that came from the Spanish chronicles that Cusco was made in the shape of a puma. Uh, and if you look at the outline of the core of the city of Cusco, you can sort of imagine a puma there. And there's controversy about that as well, whether they were talking about a puma in terms of the shape of a puma, or a puma in metaphorical terms. That the puma as the most revered of wild animals in the Andes. That there was a connection, a metaphorical connection made to Cusco as the seat of the Inca Empire.
Mm,
But no, to answer your question directly, I'm not aware of arguments that have been made, that maybe are being made now, about how constellations in the sky were projected down to Earth, or where
right.
their likeness was seen somewhere on Earth. No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably like 80s or 90s anthropological stuff that I was reading. So maybe it's coming out later. But yeah, I mean, I think there's some people that are talking about, they're showing like some, um, ancient Mayan cities that are mapped to like the Pleiades and things like that, or parts of Mexico that seem to be mapped in that way. But it's very curious to think about how they would bring that down and how much sense it makes to bring that calendar into a, onto the earth, and that they're always together, right? There's no, I think a lot of times in the modern world, we kind of separate the earth and the sky, but there was no separation previously.
Right, and well, for the Andes, I mean, the version of that I would say was very deeply ingrained in Inca culture, and still today is what I suggested about how they focused very strongly on the Milky Way. See, this is something that distinguishes the astronomy of the Incas from the astronomy of the Mayas and the Aztecs, is that they uh, they were located far north of the equator, so they could see some of the far southern stars, but they also had the advantage of a North Star. So they were in the northern hemisphere. So Polaris, the North Star, they, like all the other great civilizations of the ancient world, like the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the ancient Chinese, they all had a fixed star in the sky to orient their view of the celestial sphere. Whereas in the southern hemisphere, there is no Polaris, there is no star in the south celestial pole. So you got to sort of make it up. Like you have to. So there's a big. My point is that the view to the sky is quite different in the Andes from every other major ancient civilization, and so while I am not aware of their bringing constellations down to the ground and making likenesses of the constellations on the ground, uh, I'm not aware of that with the Inca, uh, but I am aware that they clearly saw this connection between the Milky Way, the grand structure of the Milky Way, and structures on Earth. Now, to go back to your point, the one place in the Andes where it has been argued they may have created likenesses of the constellation was in the Nazca Lines, which is on the south coast of Peru. And I mean, there's a great long history of feuds and arguments about whether or not the figures that were carved into the desert, made into the desert, whether those represented constellations. That's something we don't want to get into because that's a rabbit hole you never get out
It's
of.
that one seems like a big trap. I was there when I first moved to Peru. I came down from Lima on a bus and stopped in Nazca. Actually, at that time, my core interest was the Puquios, or the Puquios,
Oh
or I
yeah,
forget how they pronounce it, but I was
Ukios.
more interested in the aqueducts and the agriculture and the water system. But of course, I got to just kind of be in the Nazca line energy, and I saw quite a few of the lines. But yeah, I went down that rabbit hole for a couple of months afterwards, and go, oh man, this one is a mystery that will not be unraveled.
Right, right. Well, and the Pukios themselves are a big issue as well, are a big mystery as well, because we don't absolutely know, as far as I understand, if they were pre-conquest or because you have in Islamic culture, you have a very complex tradition of making subterranean canals, and
Hmm.
it's almost the only other comparable uh, uh, tradition of subterranean irrigation that you can compare the Nazca Pukios to. Anyway, we're far away from the
Yeah,
calendar
yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. No, I
Yeah.
mean it's fascinating. So with we were talking about with going back to the Milky Way. I mean, help me understand that a little bit. So what you're saying is that just in general, the entire reference point for this astronomical system is the Milky Way versus other cultures that use completely different reference points. I mean, what does that lead to in terms of the practicality of things for their culture? Or
Great question. Great question. It's well. First, let's just remember what all the other northern hemisphere ancient societies, how they organized their view to the sky. It was basically they focused on the ecliptic, and so the ecliptic is the path of the sun and the planets and the moon through the stars, and so that's this band in the sky. It's not a visible band, it's just the path from about 23 and a half degrees north of east and south of east and north of west and south of west. So that's the band within which the sun and the moon and the planets rotate. And that's also the band where all the major constellations of the Western Hemisphere are located. So Aries and Gemini and Cancer and all of the constellations are within the ecliptic. So that's how they organize their view. And and the key to it, the sort of pinwheel of the whole thing, was Polaris. It all spun around Polaris. Uh, but now we travel south of the equator. We lose the view of Polaris. We look up at the sky and we don't see anything that's fixed. There's no fixed point like a southern hemisphere Polaris. But what we do see, and much more prominently in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere, is this great white band of stars, the Milky Way. And I mentioned it before, but this is just a critical. This is a really critical thing to understand about Southern Hemisphere astronomy. Is that when you're on the Earth in the Southern Hemisphere, you see a version of the Milky Way, let's say, that is not accessible, that is not visible to people in the Northern Hemisphere. That's because of where we are located inside the galaxy, the Milky Way, that is, and the angle of the tilt of the axis of rotation of the Earth. I know we're talking about rabbit holes. We're getting down a deep rabbit hole here,
Keep
but
going.
but um, it's we are in the southern hemisphere. You're looking at the center of the galaxy, at the stars in the center of the galaxy. In the northern hemisphere, you're looking out at the distant arms of the spiral galaxy. So you're not looking at the center. So in the southern hemisphere, you see these very bright stars around the Southern Cross, around Alpha and Beta Centauri, all those very bright stars which you do not see in the northern hemisphere. Remember, the sailors in the Age of Discovery, the big deal was to see the Southern Cross finally, because they had never seen the Southern Cross. They'd heard of the Southern Cross. Travelers who'd gone to Africa had seen it. But in Europe, you don't see the Southern Cross or Alpha and Beta Centauri, those very bright stars in the center of the galaxy, which you see from the Southern Hemisphere. So to go back to your original question, whereas the Europeans and the ancient Chinese all focused on the ecliptic, in the Southern Hemisphere, the Incas and other peoples focused on what was the visual phenomenon in the sky that was most notable, which was the Milky Way. And there, I have always argued that until the time of the modern era, so at the time the Europeans discovered the Incas, the astronomy of the Incas was more complex than the astronomy of Northern Europe. And you have to remember that Copernicus didn't complete and publish the preliminary version of his heliocentric theory until 1531. The Spaniards conquered Peru in 1532. So up until that time, the pre-Copernican astronomy of the Europeans was, I would argue, not as complex in terms of its understanding of celestial motions as Inca cosmology was. And that's because the Incas coupled the their knowledge of the Milky Way with their knowledge of the ecliptic. So they, like the Europeans, recognize the ecliptic, the line of the movement through the stars of the sun, the moon, and the planets. The Inca recognized that as well, but in addition, they recognized another major celestial feature, which was the Milky Way. So they had these two bands in the sky, and they worked with that. So it was quite complex. And then to get to what I know is one of your interests, the calendar. The calendar then was the sort of summation of the recognition of different cycles. Excuse me, of different cycles of the sun and the moon and the planets and the stars.
Hmm.
Excuse me.
So in these calendars, it can get quite messy, right? Where lunar cycles don't necessarily match up with other cycles, and there's all these different components going on. Um, Tell us a little bit about that, and just in studying that, and kind of what are the challenges that you come into when trying to form a picture. And I believe even at one point in your book, you made the point that in one reference they were it's seemingly okay with it being what seemed to be like 20 degrees off, to where if anyone else was studying this, they would assume there's no way they would allow for it to be this many degrees of difference. That's just one example, but I mean, what are the types of challenges that you encounter when putting together a calendar like this?
Right. The the reference that you give to being, say, 15 or 20 degrees off, that was a spatial designation, not a temporal one. So in the village of Mismanai, when they were saying where, for instance, a certain star might rise or set, or where the sun might rise or set, they would reference a known point in the landscape. But in many cases, that point was not exactly where the star rose or set, or the sun set. So there, it was fine to do an approximation, because they were not, in that case, building a calendar for an empire. If you're building a calendar for an empire, you need much greater precision than you need in a small peasant village like Mismanai.
Right.
So to go to Cusco, so you have, I mean, the basic problem of the calendar is that you watch the sun move over the course of the year, and if you watch it from one solstice to the other solstice and back to the first solstice, and you count those days, that you get around 365 days. So that's pretty straightforward. And then you can just work with that to make a calendar. And you can put pillars on a hillside, as the Incas did, and you can see where the sun rises or sets at different times in its movement, from one solstice, one extreme, let's say to the south, to the other extreme, say to the north. And so as it passes those pillars, you can just name those units of time. But the complicated and interesting thing about the calendar is that also there's another celestial body that's moving in connection with the sun at the same time, and that's the moon. And the moon seems to have a periodicity in its phases, called the synodic cycle. There are about 12 of those as the sun is going through its 365-day cycle. So the synodic cycle, the cycle of the phases of the moon, That's every 29.5 days, and that gives you 354 days. So that's pretty close to the 365 days of the year, but pretty close is not good enough. And so the challenge of every calendar system is how do you coordinate uh, that time clock of the moon, the monthly time clock of the moon, with the steady movements through the course of the year of the sun. And some do it. Some civilizations did it one way, some did it another. But it's usually a way of finding a way to make up for that 11-day difference that gradually accumulates over time between the period of the moon over 12 phases and the period of the movement of the sun over the course of the year. I know that gets quite complicated and hard to
Mm.
conceive of, but it's just the challenge of every civilization. How do you control time? How do you devise a system that gives you the confidence that you know where you are in time? Um, and the most obvious long term marker of that is the sun, and within that, then there's the moon. And so, how do you devise a system that can be understood, that can give you meaningful periodicities of that combination between the moon and the sun? We
Right.
think we think the Incas did it. One theory is that the Incas that they had the periods incorporated in a very complicated, ritualized, highly ritualized organization of the Valley of Cusco, which was in a system called the Seki system. And the Seki system was the system of organization of society, politics, rituals, agriculture, everything in the Inca capital of Cusco. And the Seki system was a system of 41 lines. These are imaginary lines. They're directions of orientation. They're trajectories from the middle of the city of Cusco out to the horizon in 41 different directions. And along those 41 lines, the Incas recognized between uh, about a dozen or so, uh, actually between I think around 8 and 15 uh, sacred places, named sacred places in the Valley of Cusco. And there were either 328 or 350 of those, but close to the number of days in the lunar year, 354. Um, so we think that one of the ways they were, and just to back up a bit, those sacred places in the valley, different groups in the Inca capital were required to offer sacrifices to one or another of those sacred places every day of the year. So one of the ways they marked time was by the succession of sacrifices made at all the sacred places in the valley. And uh, so we think there, with that Seki system, that was the calendar. That was the basis of the calendar. I mean, that was the realization of the calendar, was the Seki system.
Mm.
It was related to the sun and it was related to the moon. And certain stars also were important in it. So the Inca calendar system was wonderfully complex in those terms, in terms of all the phenomena that it pulled into it and that it organized.
Right. And that's, yeah, wow. And that still doesn't bring in the plants and the animal part of it too, which is there.
No, no, because you have to correlate all that as well, and I mean, those would have been other markers of time that people would have been aware of, that they
Hmm.
would have been. And I think the thing to say, to recognize is that no one of those things is absolute when it comes to uh, the need to precisely mark time, at least not for agriculture. Like you need to know generally when frost comes and when frost goes. But generally, that's not an absolute day and a fixed day over the course of the year. It's a period. So you look at different things. Like this is, they would look at the Pleiades, for instance. And if the Pleiades were bright, and shiny, then that was not a good sign that it was time to plant. But if they were dim, then that meant there was atmospheric moisture, and so suggesting that there was rainfall coming, so a good time. Um, there are other ways of reading it that are almost just the opposite of that as well. But they're looking at relative periods of time and
Hmm.
looking at like you plant generally when this bird returns or that bird sings or this animal gives birth to its young or uh, and so those clearly were understood, noted, recognized uh, by people throughout the empire. And we should remember too, when we're talking about the very, very complicated calendar in Cusco, the capital of the empire, that was just the city, the capital. That was the imperial capital, and quite complex. But then travel 1,000 kilometers to the north, and you're still in the Inca Empire, but you're very very far away from Cusco. And there, those people had to build their own local calendar system. So we think probably there were lots of sort of local calendar systems that overall were coordinated by the Incas themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a great point. I mean, that's essentially what I've been learning and seeing. It's and I mean, even here, it's so fascinating because I started living originally in Calca for about 4 months, and then I was in Urubamba, then I was in Waran, and now I'm in Huicho. And so, you know, all of these areas are only, that whole distance that I just described is a max of like 35 minutes up and down the highway.
Right,
But there are so many microclimates within that. And this is actually a reason why a lot of indigenous peoples today still don't adopt modern meteorological forecasts because they're too broad and they're not specific enough to their microclimate. And so as I read the mythology and other things as well, you can start to see of, okay, I get it. Like this is why this animal would have been so important, but maybe 100 kilometers away, that animal is not as important to these people because it's not indicating to them something about their immediate environment that's as important as another species might be. And that's kind
right,
of we see that through mythology and story and song how it manifests. It's very interesting,
right,
but it's a great point that you make that it's approximate and it's alive, right? No one, the winds don't just come on May 1st because we say, hey, today's Monday, May 1st, and this is the
right,
rule of May 1st, so that these winds have to come on this day.
right, right. No, and it's not also absolute. You're suggesting it's not absolute, but it is relative. So
Mm-hmm.
that there maybe it's this animal giving birth and that phase of the moon, or like two and these plants that flower. Uh, and it's the relationship of all of these things occurring in time that gives you the signal that it's time to do this or that or the other thing. Right,
Right. It's the
right,
web. It's the
right,
web, and they're always looking at multiple things. Yeah. Yeah. Very
right.
true.
And one interesting thing that again sets the Inca Empire apart from other civilizations is that they did not invent a system of writing. So, like with the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Maya, the Mayans, and the Aztecs as well, what they knew, they set out in a script. They wrote it down. So when later people came along, they could decipher those texts and they could read what those people thought about what they were doing, what they said about, for instance, the great ninth century Greek work called Works and Days, written by Hesiod,
Fantastic.
where, yeah, where he writes about the different birds and plants that indicate different times and how that's related to agriculture. So that's wonderful, you know. But we have that for the Greeks, we have it for the Mesopotamians, the Chinese, the Mayans, but we don't have it for the Incas. The Incas did not invent a system of writing. What they did do was that they invented, although probably they inherited it from that civilization I mentioned earlier, the Wari. They used a system of knotted strings, which is called the quipu. And the quipu was a uh, system of recording information in knotted strings using a base 10 system of registering numerical data. So we think that what they did, there may be some of these objects, the quipus, that record non-numerical data. We don't really know that yet now, but at least they constructed thousands of these objects, these knotted string devices, and recorded information. And they recorded information about matters of state, so like census numbers, goods that were stored in the storehouses, uh, 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 cycles of or numbers of people born and died, etc. And uh, so they recorded a great amount of information in a coded system that the Spaniards recognized it. They saw that it was very complex. They were interested in it, but none of the Spaniards learned how to decipher it. And beginning in the late 19th century, early 20th century, people have really begun to concentrate, begin to focus on trying to understand what we have left in the remaining examples of these quipus, because that's where they recorded their knowledge of themselves in their own terms, was in those knotted string devices.
And it's almost, the quipos are interesting because they're almost like I mean, really, you could say they're a very ancient computer system, right? It's
Right.
like a very ancient numerical computer code that was tied into knots and colors on these strings. But I mean, you've spent quite a bit of time on these quipus, but it seems like that's another. I mean, do you think? I mean, is there any way to ever find clear understanding of the records of quipus, or is that just a futile pursuit?
No, I would never say that. I would never say that. I mean, it certainly is a challenge, and I don't, you know, I don't have a clear sense of how to answer the question of what were the most complex forms of information recorded in the quipus. But I mean, there are a lot of people working on it. There's a lot of research being done, a lot of computerizing
Mm.
of the very careful study of the of the 1,000 to 1,050 or 100 or so examples that exist today. There's a lot of information in those. They've all been, most of them that are not too fragile to be studied have been studied now, and there's a lot of computer analysis going on. Um, I I think that uh, I mean, and we've gotten some pretty good, clear understanding now of the numerical records of what how they were going about recording like census data, how they were recording um, data pertaining to like the storage of agricultural produce and the number of workers who were working on state projects and a lot of stuff that has a numerical value, a numerical signature, let's say, and
Hmm.
that's many things in the world.
Right.
That information's all there, and I think we will eventually be able to identify uh, a wide range of the um, numerical notation patterns that will help us reconstruct some of the core principles of the Inca Empire. Whether we will ever be able to read ones that, let's say, contain stories about the history of the origin of the Incas and how the Incas themselves told that in their coding of knots and colors and numbers. I'm hopeful, but I don't see that happening in the near term.
Right. Is there any current are there any quipus in existence that are clearly linked to celestial objects or constellations or any of the astronomy and things that we've been talking about?
Great question. We have only two quipus that I'm aware of that we can say pretty unambiguously record calendrical data. Uh, and though one is from the far north of Peru in Chachapoyas, one is from the south coast of Peru. Um, um, but I think what's important here is to recognize that um, there was an extraordinarily large uh, number of numerical values that were recorded and that are now represented in the surviving quipus. So hundreds of thousands of numerical values. And they're just sitting there. They're on strings. They're on knotted strings. And for the most part, we would have to say we don't really know what they refer to, unless there is some pattern, like a repeated pattern of numbers. We can recognize that. We also have some cases where groups of values on a set of strings are tied to another string, like a parent string that contains the sum of the value on that group of strings. So we have some cases like that. Um, and we have also we here we have to note that when the Spaniards came into Peru following 1532, they very quickly conquered the Incas, and they became very interested in how the Incas organized their empire. They recognized that if they were to inherit the empire, take it over, conquer it, and use it, it was too vast to just like kill off all the Incas and then, repopulate the land. So they had to learn how the Incas had organized this territory. So they actually began systematically calling in quipu keepers, the bureaucratic officials of the empire who kept the quipus, and they had them read the quipus to them. And then they would read it in their indigenous language, and a translator would translate it into Spanish, and a scribe would write down a version of what was recorded on the quipu.
Wow.
Now, so we have several hundred of those transcribed quipus, and for the most part, we know they pertain to economic records, to bureaucratic records, numbers of workers, amount of labor that was given, the number of resources that were collected, and then here you get, like the Incas continued to record information on the quipus after the Spanish conquest. And so you begin to get a mix of records of pre-Inca times with colonial times. So things get quite complicated at this point. But to answer your question, like I think that in those transcribed quipus, we have our best possible source for actually translating some of the more narrative types of information recorded in the quipus.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, what a just extraordinary, I think a lot of times we just assume with history it's so much cleaner and easier, and as soon as you begin to get into any of this, you realize, like, oh, I mean, if you're not, you need a bunch of linguists who are arguing over what, Quechua word was, translated into Spanish, and you need someone who's looking at the mythology aspect. You need someone who's looking at the calendar and the stars and the society. I mean, it just gets so complex so quickly to try
Right.
and understand any of this stuff.
Right. That's true. And it's why it's not a task for an individual, but it's a task for a community of people uh, working together to make advances. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I'm going to have to move on pretty
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no worries. Well, we could go on forever, so we could actually we could call it here for today. But I'm gonna have to have you on again, Gary, because we got a lot more to go through.
Okay, I'll be happy to talk to you, Justin. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for the very good questions. And yeah, so let's stay in touch. I'd be happy to do more.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm working on some kind of citizen science projects down here. So I'm actually hopefully going to go for the Pleiades viewing in June for the weather forecasting
Oh, great.
for the coming months. But I'll stay in touch. I'm going to be shipping you questions here and there that I have that hopefully you can give me perspective on as well. And I'd love to keep it going, and I'll let you know all the things that I found. Well, it was Professor Justo who actually, just really quickly to give you a reference point. There's a professor here. He's probably in his Justo must be in his 80s, maybe even his 90s, but the dude books it up the mountain faster than I
Yeah.
can. Um, and he he was a biologist at the university, but then he retired, and he's more of like an herbalist now, and he takes people up into the mountains and shows them all the different medicinal plants and things like that. And I went on this walk with him, and I started asking him kind of these calendar questions, and he just lit up and got very
Really?
excited. Oh yeah, he just said, "Oh, if you hear the fox at this time, but it's if it makes a sound that's more chattery, that's different than if it makes a sound if it's clear and consistent about the weather, and if the ducks are putting their eggs near the river, that means this
Oh,
or
that's
this and
great.
that." And he goes, and then he goes, well, there's books on these things, and he goes, Gary Urton, he doesn't speak any English. He only speaks Spanish and Quechua. And he goes, Gary Urton. And so I took down your name that day, and I came home and I opened up my Google Docs of all these people that I want to interview, and sure enough, your name was already in there from about 8 months ago. I had come across your work about 8 months ago,
Oh,
and then Professor Justo mentioned you again, and so that's when I definitely had to reach out.
oh, I'm so honored to hear that a fellow like that would reference me. That's
Yeah,
that's that's very heartwarming. Thank you,
you
Justin,
you
for
would
that.
you would love to meet him. He actually just recently found a new site outside Cusco that he's been working to protect, and he's actually fighting with the government, and he's working with the local community because the government was kind of trying to just exploit it for tourism immediately, and he's
Yeah, no,
trying to keep it a
no
little protected
surprise
for
to
some
me.
time.
That always happens.
Yeah,
Okay, listen,
but
Justin, I'm afraid
yep.
I got to run, my friend.
Okay, take
Yeah.
care. I'll see
Yes,
you.
we will be talking. Okay,
All
bye
right, bye
bye.
bye.
Not sure how to get